Hey, podcast listeners. I'm Barbara Morgan, and you're listening to Austin Film Festival's On Story podcast. This week on On Story, we're joined by The Man in the High Castle and Underground Railroad writer Jihan Crowther and King Richard screenwriter Zach Baylin for a conversation on fact versus fiction. Jihan Crowther is a television writer and playwright whose credits include The Underground Railroad, The Man in the High Castle, and Here and Now. A graduate of the University of London Goldsmiths College, Crowther's plays have been read and produced all over New York and LA. She's been a New York Foundation for the Arts Screenwriting Playwriting Fellow, a New York Theater Workshop Emerging Artist Fellow, and an alumni of both Ensemble Studio Theater's Youngblood Collective and the LA-based Playwrights Union. She's currently a writer and co-producer on the upcoming Apple series, If Then. Zach Baylin is a screenwriter best known for penning the screenplay for the critically acclaimed biopic King Richard, starring Will Smith, and for co-writing Creed III. A graduate of Johns Hopkins University, Baylin got his start as a production assistant and set dresser for film and television, including Dave Chappelle's Block Party, Boardwalk Empire, and Gossip Girl. He wrote the King Richard screenplay after attending the 2017 U.S. Open. The film earned 6 Academy Award nominations, including Best Original Screenplay. Moderator Casey Baron sat down with the pair to discuss tackling real-life events and how they translate on screen at a panel at the Austin Film Festival. Clips of The Underground Railroad and The Man in the High Castle, courtesy of Amazon Studios. Clips of King Richard, courtesy of Warner Brothers Pictures.
Part of the description for the panel included the words "based on a true story" or inspired by true events. Pardon me. I'm curious what that means to both of you, both from the perspective of audience members, and I'm thinking fans of historical fiction and true sort of stories, but also as crafts people in this sense as well.
Well, I'd say specifically like the idea of like based on versus inspired by. We talked a lot about that with King Richard. And I mean, I think for me, like based on, our film is based on, and I really wanted that to be clear because the factualness of the story was so important to the characters and to making sure we understood like how improbable what that family achieved was. And so making sure that the audience knew going in that like, this is factual. Almost everything that I've written has started from something I've read and something I wanted to examine.
I sort of approach things the same way because it's really, you're still trying to tell a story that's interesting and that you are, I don't know, excited by in some way. And so I'm somebody who actually, I really enjoy research. Like I love like just digging into like little details and like sort of specific things you can find when you're just, you know, reading different articles or books or pertaining to what you're writing about, and sort of try to go and see what was actually happening, and maybe that also jogs some memories.
I find research particularly insightful and interesting from a development standpoint. Could you just dive into a little bit further the process for both of you, what your research looks like when you jump into a new project?
So I wrote on a show called Daisy Jones and the Six that was about a 70s rock band, and it was a fictional rock band, but it was based on or inspired by a very real one. And so a lot of our research was like super fun research, which was just like watching like rock documentaries and talking to people who were sort of in the music industry at the time. And those were some of my favorite because then I can just ask a million questions and sort of get a real color of like what the time was like. Then I just like to really read like little articles from the time to see like what people who are writing about the time at the time actually felt about that period. Like I find that to be really interesting and to bring like a different perspective. But the 60s were so bonkers, like, and so much going on. And you're just kind of like, how did people feel? What was acceptable and what felt like normal is so different now. And I kind of I always like to sort of have a sense of what people at the time felt about something, what of the time actually meant.
I think that reading like contemporaneous accounts and contemporaneous articles about the time period that you're writing in is really important for exactly the same reason you said that. Like when I was researching King Richard, that totally informed to me the way that Richard was viewed at the time in the 90s. I think was pretty contentious, and to understand that lens and how we should be looking at him now was super important.
Also curious about balancing sort of the ethical and moral choices or dilemmas that may come up when you have to make, let's say, quote, creative decisions or take creative liberties to flesh out a narrative when you're dealing with a historical event or larger than life historical person or figure?
It's tricky, especially when the people that you're writing about are alive. And I mean, I think that the process with King Richard, I wrote that script without the family's involvement originally. So we've sort of felt, the producers and I, that if we were going to get their blessing and get their trust to actually like build it out in the right way, that the only chance was to sort of bring them a script that was representative of what we thought it could be. I tried to just be as factual as possible so that, you know, what I was showing them was, you know, felt as true as possible. But it's complicated because one, everyone remembers certain events differently, and particularly this story was about their childhood and trying to go back and be like, what did your parents, you know, what was dinner time like when you were 8? I don't remember that as so you're sort of then again like extrapolating through a lens of time and memory. But for us on that film particularly, it was really important to have it be as grounded in fact as possible.
Well, the show that I'll be referencing is like, it's Underground Railroad. So that was about a specific time period, and it's historical fiction. But I don't know if any of you guys read the book by Colson Whitehead. It's just genius. But he went to great pains to make each chapter was about a specific chapter in American history. And so there's a lot of things that were rooted in fact that were also then extrapolated into the story that we read. And so when we were creating that show, Barry was very much about everything that we are doing has to feel true to the story, but also true to that period of history, because it's such, the way it's taught in America gives you, every state has different feelings about slavery, right? So like, even like I grew up in Virginia, and we were taught about it as like, the North is like getting in our business. And so I remember repeating that at home, and my mom's like, sorry, what? So we had to we wanted to be as clear as possible about that period and about what people actually lived through and what their lives actually looked like. And so that was really very intense research, but it was also worthwhile, because if you were sort of thinking about where would maybe Cora, or, you know, what might she be thinking? And like, you're reading different slave narratives, and you have a greater sense of what her true next steps are. And of course, Colson did a lot of the heavy lifting in the book. So yeah, like when writing about that period, even if it's fiction, I feel like it has to be rooted in what actually happened to the people of that time.
Jihan, I'm curious. There's certainly a lot of painful moments tied to the Underground Railroad and what you try to represent, going back to that earnestness. How did you all balance that while also, from my perspective, imbuing the show with this sense of hope as well at every turn?
I think the story itself in a lot of ways was like a hopeful story. Somebody who was living in a time, and it's hard to think about how many generations slavery went on, where people were, their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were enslaved, and their great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren would be enslaved. And with Cora and, you know, some of the other characters, it felt like they imagined a life for themselves that didn't exist and they didn't know was possible, because there was, of course, so much limited on most plantations. Like, the information is limited. What people are able to find out, it's a lot of like whispering, and, you know, maybe you hear some gossip about what's happening on another farm, but it's all like this internal understanding of yourself and your place in the world, and wanting to like go forward, whatever that takes, right? So we just kind of went with the spirit of that, and just different narratives, just even reading like Frederick Douglass and, you know, a lot of really sort of famous people of the time, but just sort of smaller slave narratives where you're just like, oh, that need to be free is just like, that's just human nature. And then that makes those generations of enslavement just all the more just devastating.
See that red roof there? That's us.
You mean that's you? Don't nobody know I'm coming.
What they do now? You ready?
We took the hard stuff and it was, I mean, really hard. Like there would be days where Barry's like, everybody okay from what we were talking about the day before. And, you know, we'd go home and do research. And even he extended that to when they were shooting, which he had a therapist on the set in case anybody needs to talk about any of the work they were doing or what they were experiencing. Obviously, it's so realistic.
And Zach, what drew you to this project, and what really sort of propelled you to continue the development process on it? Like we talked about, it took a little time to get the Williams family involved and work through some of the script process with them. So I'm just curious if you could talk about that a bit.
So if you don't know, that there's like this kind of legendary story that Richard, who was not a tennis player, was a security guard in Compton in the 70s, watched a tennis match on TV and saw the victor, a young woman, like get a big check, which was more money than he had made it in the year. And he sort of said, well, if I had daughters, they could be better than this. So he wrote a sort of legendary 80-page plan like that night of everything. Like if I am going to teach these girls how to play tennis, here's what I'll do. Here's how they'll have to learn multiple languages. This is the hours of the day they'll have to train, all this stuff. But he had never played tennis. He didn't have any sort of inroads into the sport. And Venus and Serena had not been born yet. Essentially, everything, he had this plan. He had Venus and Serena. He already had 3 other daughters who were a little bit older. And he like started shopping, going around to coaches and country clubs and trying to raise money and get coaches to coach them pro bono.
This deal you're asking for, you know, all of this for free, Richard, nobody's taking that bad. You know, tennis is a technical game, you know, probably one of the most, and if you didn't grow up with the game, then yeah, it's like playing the violin. You know, it takes hours and hours a day, you know, year after year of expensive, expert instruction just to hold the thing right. Yeah, and even then, even for families with unlimited financial resources, the chances of achieving the kind of mastery and success that you're talking about, I mean, for one kid, let alone 2, it's like asking somebody to believe that you got the next 2 Mozarts living in your house.
And obviously, essentially everything that he predicted in that plan happened. So I sort of knew that story tangentially because I'm a big tennis fan. And then I had a meeting with a producer who had been trying to sort of get that story off the ground. It was very just kind of fortuitous that we met. And I also I have young kids, and I really had been interested in writing about like being a parent and, you know, and about like the American dream in a way, but maybe through a perspective that like doesn't get told. And I just sort of fell in love with Richard. I mean, I kind of knew as soon as the conversation started that I was like, could be a really impactful, you know, story. And it covered, like, I think when I'm looking for something, you know, does it have a huge character at the heart of it? Is the story itself like just propulsive and churning, and like, can it get your, you know, blood going? And then does it have a chance to really just connect with an audience? There was no other story that I'd been around that felt that powerful. We got very lucky that Will Smith sort of had read the script fairly early on, and we knew he was interested. But again, everyone knew we needed the family's involvement. I think you always you have a real duty to get it right, but I felt particularly in this case that if I got it wrong, it was going to be very disastrous. In terms of like I had so much archival footage of Richard. So beginning there, I knew that I could at least like get his voice correct, because a lot of times I was frankly like, you know, using a lot of real dialogue that he had said. And that was a great like guiding stone for me. And then also I knew going in that it was to really get it right, that we would need to be able to sit down and allow Venus and Serena and Oracene and Richard really like talk about experiences that I would not have been a part of. And so, going in and having the opportunity to sit with the real people and to say, like, what was your experience here? What were the things you were frustrated about? What was bedtime like in the house when you have 5 kids? They're sleeping in the same bedroom and everyone has to get up in the morning and, be on the tennis court by 7 a.m. and do your homework and do all this stuff.
You all wrote in your journals, made your plans for tomorrow?
Yes, Daddy.
That's right, got to have a plan for every day, else what?
No plan, you plan to fail.
That's right, we not failing, are we?
No, Daddy.
Okay, all the way to the top.
Come on, Mika.
You know, one day not too long from now, somebody gonna hand you girls a check for $1 million. And you gonna buy as many beds as you want.
And one check, really?
Maybe even a couple of them. But we're not gonna be like this forever, okay?
Okay.
All right. You girls go to bed.
Good night, Daddy.
So it's like just trying to capture the day-to-day, struggles of what that was like.
From the sort of perspective that for you, Jihan, you've had work on The Man in the High Castle and now The Underground Railroad, 2 pieces that were developed based off of historical fiction or novels, pardon me. So how did you go about, in your writer's room, developing those characters, maybe further adding some pieces to them that may not have been represented in the novel?
Yeah, with Man in the High Castle, by the time I joined the room, we were already off book. So a lot of it was just brand new invention. And we had, but the approach they took to the book is like the book was like the Bible. And so it was just constant referencing that, and anything we built outside of that had to feel like it was truly part of that world. And then also we were really lucky to have Philip K. Dick's daughter as the executive producer. And she, first of all, is like an incredible producer and such a great collaborator. And for the 4th season, there were lots of sort of stories that he started and didn't get to finish. And we used some of those stories to create the sort of arc for the 4th season. And so I found that to be really exciting. It's just secret papers. I love those kinds of things, And we really were just, always devoted to the characters. What would, John Smith do? And that research, and some of that research that we did, because I was sort of new to the group, included reading up about not just Nazism, but the way America has similar impulses. And that's also where I learned, which things we don't learn in school, that Hitler was actually influenced by American race culture and would give speeches about the complete, how complete the Native American genocide was. And was and really actually was surprised that we joined the Allies during World War II, because he's like, this is just these are your ideas. And it's that's correct.
When you were researching for that or researching for Underground Railroad, did you ever find that you were you found a piece of research that was obviously something that Colson had used to write the book, and then through that could see, this is cool how he extrapolated it, and maybe I would have used this I would have turned this into a different scene. But did you find that you found the same research and then you got to see what his process in writing the book was?
Yeah, there were a couple of things like that. Now more people know about the Tulsa race riots because of The Watchmen, but I only knew a little bit. And so as we were researching that, you could sort of see clearly in the chapter of I don't want to spoil the book in case you haven't also, but I feel like I can't spoil something that's been around for a while. So for Indiana, you're just oh, this was based on that kind of, these are people who were able to create their own, society, since they weren't accepted into other societies. And then it was, became too much for the surrounding sort of white community, and they had to burn it to the ground. And so learning about the Tulsa race riots and seeing, and then going back and rereading the Indiana chapters, you just sort of felt a clarity. And then later learning there were a number of communities that happened to, it sort of just felt like you're sort of representing this piece of history that at the time I think a lot of people didn't know about, and people still don't really know about, and also something like the North Carolina chapter where Black people are illegal. And that was based on Oregon, which was founded as a white supremacist state. So Black people weren't allowed to even be there until late 1920s, I think. And there's still areas where it's like, don't come here. And I think that's something that maybe fans who read the book and did a deep dive would then learn about Oregon. And for me,
That's awesome.
and then you could go back to like North Carolina and be like, okay, that's this like level of danger versus just any place else where Black people were even allowed to be seen. It was still dangerous for them, but it's a completely different thing when it's like, you don't belong in this state. And that was really fascinating.
Oh, that's cool. It's cool to see like how someone else also like that. He obviously read that, and then how you see like how his adaptation mind works.
But were there a couple of particular moments from King Richard and Jihan, you can speak to the Underground Railroad or The Man in the High Castle, that you were really looking forward to seeing that in its final sort of produced stage?
Later in the film, there's a big like kind of argument between Richard and Orsine, his wife. That's sort of like where everything from the movie has, between their characters for years, sort of bubbles to the surface.
Do you think you did this by yourself?
From the first day we met. Remember that? Out on that bus stop? You didn't even tell me your real name. Because you thought I was just another dumb. You just like them white boys. You never believed in none of this.
When did I not believe? I want you to tell me, when did I not believe? You're not the only dreamer in this family. Wouldn't be no dream if it wasn't for me. I carried them inside me and on my back. And I carried you too. Working 2 shifts so I could put food on your table. That open stance, you got that from me.
Oh, you did that? Oh, okay.
That was I find like arguments to be the sort of the funnest things to write. And that scene is really explosive, and it would always existed in the script. And then on the day of the shoot, we sat down with, or the night before, we knew we were shooting the next day, and stayed late on set with Will and Anjanou, the woman who plays Orsine, who's incredible. And just like rehearsed and rebroke the scene and rewrote it.
I think for TV, because the writing process is so much more collaborative, starting to just being like murdered in front of you because they're just like, you're just kind of like love a scene and they're like, oh, I think that goes in episode 9. You're like, no, episode 9 doesn't deserve that scene. But like it ultimately like makes, sense. And so I think with my episode of Man in the High Castle, there was like the sequence of scenes, and I was originally supposed to have this scene where like I get to kill Nazis in this really great way. And I was just like, yes, like get to kill Nazis. And then they were like, we're actually moving that. I think that belongs in 2 episodes down. And I was just like, I was told I could kill Nazis. And so, and I had like this whole like choreography. I was like, yes, I have the scene. And then it was like gone. And so I just had to be like, okay, that's fine. And then just trying to think of like something else that felt true to the story, but kind of fresh. And so I write plays as well. I started in theater, and I love musicals, although I'm not very good at writing musicals. But there was this song that we learned about that the British soldiers used to sing called Hitler's Only Got One Ball, which I love. And I was just like, I got to have a song and dance. And so, like, I conspired with one of my showrunners. I was just like, David, I need to have that song. I want them to dance. And he's just like, what? And so I kind of explained what the scene would be, and really it was just about when people are in revolution. We see, of course, the sort of struggles, but there's also moments of joy because there have to be. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to make it, right? So, and that's something that hadn't been kind of touched on the show before. And so I thought, here's a moment. This is a quiet moment. In a way, we can make a scene of it that feels different and that feels true to anybody who's in revolution. And I think a lot about Malcolm X, we like read his words a lot, but sometimes you'll watch him in a video and he's actually like laughing or like smirking. He's just like, no, which I really love. And so like, I just kind of, so somebody who's in the middle of something can find joy, and that's what we did. And so I remember I was like, I'm going to name the episode Hitler's Only Got One Ball. Like, I'm committed, like this is not getting cut. It's not getting cut. And so I remember it was like, okay, we have to like pitch it to like Amazon. And then we were at a party for some other show. And they're like, okay, like let's get our exec aside and start to talk about it. And as I was talking about it, his face was like, and I was like, never mind, wait till you read it. But like, ultimately I got it. But like, it was like, because of the death of this other thing that I was able to like fight for that. So yeah.
Persistence is key.
Yeah, that's hilarious. You brought up a good point that when you were talking about sort of Malcolm X laughing, that I think like something that I've found over the course of writing a couple of these like true stories is that like these characters, like someone as as iconic as that, or that they can become like these personifications of them can become calcified as like all you know is the interview that you've seen on TV or like the famous moments, and trying to find a way to be like, well, that's not going to be, if you're just going to show that, then just like a documentary might be the best way to do that. But if you want to like create a fully realized character, then you want to see like, what were they like in the morning when they woke up and were like hungover, and what were they, what were their light moments, and not just sort of rely on the presentation that they might have wanted to put out to the world. Because like, I think when you're watching a movie, you want to see like the inner person and not just the image that we all like, you're playing different people all the time in your life. And so it's like, how do you show the like underneath and the vulnerability and all that stuff? So
how do you strike that balance of, for example, catering to big moments, but also really respecting those characters, especially in a context like with King Richard, where you have a living character still able to give advice in the script process and things of that nature?
I don't know. When I write when I like outline a script, I know that I'm going to have, okay, these are these huge, these are the sort of turning points, big touchstones in the movie. So like that these will, even if it's not a explosion, like these are the set pieces. This is like the first time Venus plays a junior tournament. What is that going to feel like when the family walks into a white country club for the first time?
Look at that. Look at that. Come on. You see who that is?
Yes.
Who's that?
John McEnroe.
That's right. Who's that?
That's Pete Sampras.
Mm-hmm. One day, they're going to be bragging about the time they met the two of you.
There are certain moments that you say, I know this is, one, like the scale of the emotion and the scale of the world building is going to be big. But then again, I think it's always just looking about like, I think that you want to walk the audience into that through these specific characters. So yes, we're going to introduce this huge setting, but it's like, what was it like for Richard? What was it like for Venus and Serena and Orsine? Like, what were anxieties and all those little sort of day-to-day things? What were they bringing into that moment?
And Jihan, between Man in the High Castle and Underground Railroad, both pieces utilize magical realism and sort of recontextualizing our ideas of these historical events in such a fascinating way. As a writer's room, how did you all go about the process of utilizing that mechanic and that storytelling technique?
I think for Man in the High Castle, it was about like not letting it spin out of control, because we were just like, maybe they can go in the past, and like we just like go crazy, and then we're like, okay, so then actually what's the story? And having to go back and making sure to not overutilize things like John Smith going to the past, or going to not to the past, to an alternate world, and not still focusing on like the sort of matter at hand and like the period at hand, because it can be really fun to like play with those things, and I don't know, it's always exciting when you can do anything that feels like a little bit like magic, or that like adds this kind of sparkle to something. And so I think for Man in the High Castle, and which was such a different room from Underground Railroad, it was really about, is this going to function? Is this going to tell the story better than if we didn't use it? And so, and then we would then move from there and sort of have those discussions. And sometimes you're trying to make it work. It doesn't work. You have to start again. But you want to make sure that you're still telling the story. It doesn't like sort of go off the rails. And I think, and then for the Underground Railroad, it's so interesting because the sort of magical realism aspect of it and the kind of sci-fi aspect of it is so light. It almost doesn't feel like it's happening. So even something like an elevator is actually magical for that period because, of course, it didn't exist, like the idea of a high rise. And so, and that was, Coulson's whole invention. And so that was really exciting. And to sort of work with this idea of like people in this period being more advanced than the time allowed. And so there were like those moments that felt like almost like bringing the future in, but in a way that felt like it was a natural part of the story. And a lot of that was Coulson's writing. And then then the other half of it was, of course, was Barry's just sort of genius brain coming up with like, oh, what about this and that? And there was a scene that happened where we were like working in this room. I think it was like a WeWork office or something. And where we were, like there were birds in the neighborhood that just loved the window outside of us. And they were huge. So for the first 2 weeks, it looked like somebody was jumping off the building like a couple times a day. So it'd be like, and they're like, okay, it's just the bird, it's just the bird. And so it was like, so that like then kept like, eventually like made its way into the story as we were talking, because it just felt like there's something about this like elevator and like the high rise, and it all kind of felt like melding.
When you're on something like Underground, where I assume, or if you're going to be given a specific episode, but that there obviously wants to be this completely unified voice through the whole course of the thing. How do you collectively sort of decide what the voice on the page is going to be?
Yeah. So really the main voice of any show is always the showrunner. And so like they kind of set the tone of like, this is what I'm aiming for. This is what it's going to be. And a lot of times before you start a room, you have the pilot. So you have a sense of like the
So
tone.
there was a pilot.
Yeah. Well, there wasn't a pilot for this, but this is, I think, Barry having like a filmmaker background, which was like, we had like all of these like videos and like slideshows and we're like, and like music cues. So we had a sense of like, okay, this is the story that we're writing. And then, so we came in fully understanding like what he was aiming for. So then as you're pitching, you're kind of pitching to, what the goal of the showrunner is, and kind of like taking apart you sort of take apart the novel first and then kind of put it back together as like a show. And so you're kind of going through the book thinking, okay, this is what he's trying to achieve. This is what we've all decided to achieve. And Barry's such a great collaborator that it's not just like his way or the highway. If you have a better idea, he wants to hear it. So you've sort of collectively decided this is the show we're making, and then you're just sort of pitching towards that and coming up with ideas about that. So when you do read all of the scripts, it feels like one writer wrote them all. Even
down to like the way you write your action, like the prose on the page.
Yeah.
I was just fascinated by the fact that both of your pieces, Jihan and Zach, certainly with King Richard, the colors within them are so rich and saturated. And for me, I recall so many different historical pieces, especially pieces covering World War II, for example. They go in a different route. It's a lot grayer, a lot more brown sort of colors in that tonal palette. I'm curious how that may have affected, if at all, your narrative development.
I think for High Castle and for Underground Railroad, it's really like shout out to amazing cinematographers who can like read the script that you're writing and like come up with like, okay, we think this, this is the way we can light this. But we as like sort of writing it, the script is it's a little bit of like, it's a story, but it's also like an instruction manual for like the department heads in a way. It's like, this is what I hope it looks like. This is what the vibe is.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're like writing a script, at least I try to really capture like a vibe in the prose so that it's like you're at least telling the reader, like, this is how I feel like this movie. When you're reading this, I want you to get the energy that you're eventually going to get on screen. So, we got so lucky on this movie. When I sat down, I met Robert Elswit So Robert shot There Will Be Blood, and Michael Clayton, and he shot our movie. And he and the director, Ray Green, who's amazing, like, I think took a really unexpected sort of lens on the movie. So it actually is like, it's extremely warm and sort of domestic. It feels intimate in a way that maybe you would think like it's a period movie, or something that has a sports lens would be like harsher, more like energetic, and it has this really lyrical look to it, and it's beautiful. So, which is not exactly the way I had envisioned it, but when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is brilliant.
On Story is brought to you in part by the Alice Kleberg Reynolds Foundation, a Texas family providing innovative funding since 1979. And by the Bogle Family Vineyards, 6th-generation farmers and 3rd-generation winemakers based in Clarksburg, California. Makers of sustainably grown wines that are a reflection of their family values since 1968. This project is supported in part by the Cultural Arts Division of the City of Austin Economic Development Department, the Texas Commission on the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts on the web at arts.gov. Our associate producers are Jamal Knox and Colin Heyer. Editing help from Travis Neely and Travis Kennedy Sound. Music by Brian Ramos. Production assistance comes from the Sound Lab Inc., Travis Kennedy Sound, and KUT 90.5 in Austin. Go to austinfilmfestival.com to find out more about the Austin Film Festival and Conference each October. Until next time, I'm Barbara Morgan, and this has been Austin Film Festival's On Story.